So I was checking out this psychiatrist and psychologist, Dr. Gregory Popcak. Actually, I find him very interesting. And he mentions this study on what's called attachment theory. And the interesting part about this, I love this kind of weird stuff, is that studying children and their moral development, attachment theory is this, is that if you take a child and you just pour love upon this child, that love in years to come will kind of congeal and form into this moral code. Love teaches a child empathy and then compassion, and then from compassion they build this moral code. And so really, when you're taking a baby or a child and you're just loving it, you're really building its future moral code in this attachment theory. And the opposite of this would be if you don't really give a child really that much love, but a lot of moral legalisms, they don't really develop a moral code, or at least an odd one. And the example would be like Romanian orphanages that, in case you didn't know, are horrendous. And they basically take the child and prop it in the corner with a bottle, and they'll feed it and take care of it, but they don't really pour a lot of love into them. And what happens in their moral development is that the odd part is you can teach that child moral legalisms, like do this, don't do that, but they never really seem to understand compassion. It's very odd. They can be moral, but morality based on rules and regulations, not morality of just deep compassion. And attachment theory is this idea that there's a lot of proof out there that love turns into this morality. And one proof, and I just love this one, was the righteousness studies from Israel. You remember I talked about this once before. Do you guys remember that one? Only one person? I yell at you people every single week. And anyhow, I didn't really expect you to remember, but they did this thing after World War II in Israel where they tried to figure out what were the common denominators that, like, for these Gentiles, us Gentiles, why did they resist Nazism and hide Jews? And why did this group, even if they're basically law-abiding people, they just went along with Nazism? What's the difference? And one of the key differences was actually, of the two groups, was parenting, where, parents A was attachment theory, that they poured a lot of love into their children. And they gave them rules, because believe it or not, this sounds strange, children want boundaries. They want to know when they're stepping over the line. Believe it or not, that shows love. And in parenting A, you throw a lot of love into them and you teach them why this is a rule. You do this, you clean up after yourself because it's not nice to leave it for somebody else. You explain why, but you give them rules. The opposite of that is not really pouring love into them. These Gentiles, they're just taught, their parents basically only taught them moral legalisms. Do this or you're punished. But not why, and not throwing a lot of love at them. So when Nazism came up, it'd be like, well, it's legal to kill Jews, so we'll do it, but we don't speed or cuss. It's this odd morality. No, but that's exactly what it is. And what they found out is people, parenting A, that poured a lot of love into their children, what that love develops into, yes, is a moral code. And I love this idea. It develops into this stubborn moral code. Doesn't matter what's legal or not legal. I will not participate with Nazism. I'll even risk my own life saving Jews. That I love this idea of extreme love is connected with stubbornism, moral stubbornism. And so attachment theory is morality actually starts with this overflow of love. And my idea, and this is the point of my homily, is that the sacraments are kind of like attachment theory, where what Christ pours out to us in the sacraments is really life and love. And if you notice in the Gospel of John, Jesus never really preaches a lot of moral legalisms. He doesn't say you have to do this, and then you have to do this, and you have to do this. It's the opposite. He really preaches a lot about love and the bread of life. And in the Gospel of John, that's his two big subjects. So we're talking about the bread of life, the bread from heaven, and it's going to be 3 weeks. If he ever talks about love or bread of life, it's 3 weeks. Because really, he doesn't give us moral legalism. He fills us with love and life. And that's supposed to congeal into this stubborn moral code. And if you think about it, only a mother in Christ can give their bodies to feed their children. And that feeding really is love. Love, or I should say the Eucharist, it's supposed to turn into this stubborn action. And so in the Gospel of John, it's actually kind of hidden there, especially in chapter 6, which we're going over, the Bread of Life series, the bread from heaven. And now, this gets a little nerdy, but I love this stuff. The Gospel of John is written in what's called a chiastic structure. The Greeks wrote in what's called a chiastic structure. It means like a pyramid, and the really important stuff happens actually in the middle, in the peak of the pyramid. Americans, we write differently. We write where it's the concluding line that is the most important. Like, Dear John letter, it was great getting to know you. I hate you. Please never contact me again. It happens at the end. For the Greeks, it happens in the middle. And you know where it is because, like a stair-step pyramid, there's 2 of everything in the gospel. On this side of the gospel, you'll have somebody blind healed. On this side of the gospel, somebody likewise is healed. On this side of the gospel, he touches a leper. On this side of the gospel, he touches a leper. There's 2 of everything, but at the very peak, there's only 1. And so it's a summation of everything in the gospel, and that is the bread from heaven. I am the living bread came down from heaven. If you feed on my flesh and gulp down my blood, you will have life. If you do not, you have no life within you. That whole speech is the very top. And the idea is all these acts of love lead to the Eucharist. And then once you share in the bread of life, the bread from heaven, then your whole life is poured out in loving action for other people. So Jesus doesn't really give like moral codes to live by. He feeds us his body and blood. What he does is, in the attachment theory, is pour love into us, and then the rest of our life is pouring love out for other people. That's our moral code. It's a chiastic structure. And in the bread from heaven, the real shocking part is that we would say the bread from heaven is not an it, it's a person. And that's the really shocking part. Because if you remember, in Judaism, the big sign that will prove that you're the Messiah is that you can call that bread from heaven. Moses prayed, and the bread from heaven came down, and the Messiah can do the same thing. So that's going to prove that you're the Messiah. And the Jews believe the bread from heaven was 3 things. 1, it was holy. 2, they say it pre-existed the creation of the world. Before creation was even made, in heaven there's a temple, and there is the bread of heaven. And 3, it was always attended to by the angels. So sometimes you'll hear the Eucharist called the bread of the angels. It's not because the angels feed on the bread. The angels have to obey the bread from heaven. And so they're surrounding it. And so this is the really odd part. Jesus just does the feeding of the 5,000. So now they think Jesus is the Messiah. So they go to him and they say, do the sign being make the bread come. And he says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. That part shocked them. They believe there's a connection between the Messiah. They believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But what they had trouble believing is that the Messiah was the bread from heaven. That's the difference, no offense, God bless them, between Protestants and Catholics. Protestants do believe that Jesus is the Messiah, But we take one step further and believe the Messiah is also the bread from heaven that came down from heaven. And the idea is, in this kind of ultimate attachment theory, we who feed on the life of Christ, like Christ, we pour out our lives in action of pouring out our lives in love for other people. So our morality really is this great attachment theory of the sacraments. We who are given love and life, it congeals into this moral code of helping other people. And so, if you know the first reading is really odd. You have the prophet. And this is a conversion story. The prophet, he's a good person, and he spends his life preaching against the corruption in the government and preaching against the corruption in religion. And yes, sometimes there's corruption even in the church. It's caused mostly by the deacons, but whatever. So the prophet is fighting against all this. And, the problem is there's so much injustice and corruption in the world. You can throw yourself at it, and you should. But if it's just about moral legalisms, the world is going to kick you in the teeth. There's just too much of it. And so that's where this reading picks up, where he's just exhausted. And he falls under a tree and he says, he prays, God, just kill me. It's too much. And what does God do? God sends an angel with bread, so that should let you know what kind of bread it is. It's this bread from heaven. And an angel comes and feeds the prophet the bread. And when he's eaten it, the angel shakes him awake and says, no, you have to eat more. And he eats it. And then he walks 40 days and 40 nights. And the point being is that, we can't overcome the corruption in the world by our power alone. But you eat the bread from heaven, and then you pour out your life in love for other people. It's not about overcoming all the problems in the world. It's about you just pouring out your life in love. So this is his conversion from moral legalisms to really this kind of Eucharistic, pour out your life in love. And eventually you'll win, but not by taking it, fighting it. And the angel says, and I love this line, the journey is too long. The journey is too long. You have to eat bread. So for us, the journey of life, it's too long just to fight on our own. So in kind of this attachment theory, today we're fed with the life and love of God. And hopefully for the rest of our lives will be poured out in love to make the world a better place.